Welcome back to the Scientific Café, a place where we discuss with experts about pressing issues of our time. This year, we're focusing on education and climate change. Today, we are honored to have Professor Paul Howard Jones from University of Bristol. He will tell us how neuroscience can improve education for climate change. Hello, Paul. How are you? Let's start with talking about a bit yourself and what motivates your current research.
I began my career, I suppose, doing an engineering degree and then a PhD in medical physics. And I became a school teacher teaching design and technology. And in fact, the first book that I wrote was about a set of projects for school students using appropriate technology that was environmentally friendly. But as a teacher, I was very I really noticed how atheoretical teaching and education was. There didn't seem to be an understanding of how learning took place that was scientifically based. And I used to spend a lot of my lunch hours as a teacher. I used to bunk off down to the university and look at psychology books and try to understand how learning was supposed to be happening in the classrooms that I was teaching. And I mean, to cut a long story short, that really gave rise to that 25-year career of trying to develop a science of learning for education. I did another degree in psychology, and I started using my my understanding from my PhD to apply brain imaging in educational research. Started training teachers, doing more educational research, and inspecting schools actually as well. But all the time developing this research which was bridging neuroscience and education to try to apply what we know about the mind and the brain to foster learning in the classroom more effectively. And I mean, the weird thing was that about 8 years ago, I then wrote a book about how the learning brain evolved. And it was in the last chapter of that I was thinking about the future of the learning brain and how we were going to address the challenges that we face. And of course, one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge, is climate change. And it brought me round full circle to wanting to apply what I had learned about how we learn to climate change education, because I'm just convinced that how much environmental depletion and to some extent, the extent of human conflict we face in the future will depend on how quickly and efficiently we can achieve that sort of learning about the environment and learn to change our attitudes and our behaviors.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And then then lead me to my second question. Like, what are the most important and surprising things that you've learned and discovered through your work?
I do a lot of different types of research. So some of the research I do is in the classroom. Some of it is systematic reviews of the concepts. And I do some lab-based research as well. As I've also done, as I say, brain imaging research in the past as well. I think a key message that's come through to me in this area of action for climate empowerment, which is the term that UNESCO use for climate change and sustainability education, it's not like other types of education. And I think generally the educational institutions are being a bit slow to realize that it's a very different type of learning, and it recruits very different types of processes in the brain. And I think it shouldn't be a surprise to everybody, but I think that probably is the big surprise, if you like, that I would really like to get that message across, because I don't think we're going to really be able to develop effective education in this area until we come to understand that. An example of that is the involvement of a brain network called the default mode network. And the default mode network activates whenever we imagine the future. So we know that imagining the future is a really important part of changing our attitudes and wanting to take action in the area of the environment and climate change. So it's no surprise that we see this network activating when we start thinking about what we're going to do in the future, and when we start thinking about climate change and the different scenarios that we might be facing. But actually, sometimes this network is called the mind-wandering network. So I know from brain imaging research that I've done myself that actually it's quite an effective marker in terms of how much you're paying attention to the outside world and to the facts and the knowledge that the teacher might be presenting you with, but not in a positive way, in a negative way. So if your default mode network is activating, it's because you're thinking about yourself in future scenarios and you're not really paying attention to what the teacher is saying. When you need to pay attention in a normal educational traditional sense, you're actually activating what we call the task positive network, which is much more about executive function and planning and thinking, and about facts and understanding and the information that's being presented to you. And these two networks are what scientists call anti-correlated, so they can't be on at the same time. So there's a real issue here in terms of taking on board a set of mental processes which we don't normally concern ourselves with in the traditional classroom. And these are processes, as I say, about imagination and about thinking about the future and about oneself and one's role in that future. So that's a very fundamental issue that's come through from looking at the neuroscience. You've got two anti-correlated networks, one for traditional education, one for this other thing, which is also, by the way, involved with creativity. And creativity is quite important for finding solutions to environmental problems as well. But it's also very important for thinking about the future, this network. So, that really indicates to me that we have to think afresh about this area of education. And just, changing content, just thinking we're going to use a standard model of classroom learning and just changing the content to climate change and sustainability, that's not going to work very well.
We can look at the children growing up today. How does climate change affect them differently, depending also the different stage of development and age?
One of the things we need to think about is the fact that children are developing, and different children require different stimulus at different points and are thinking about things in a different way at different ages. And therefore, one of the things I think we struggle with a little bit is thinking about what is the age appropriateness of different types of education in this area. So, for example, we are beginning to understand how important it is for children when they're very young to develop a connection with nature. Important for children to be having those experiences, because not just to learn about the environment and to form a relationship with the environment, but also because those experiences are developing some quite fundamental cognitive processes. So, for example, a lot of our care and why we care about the environment arises originally, you can sort of trace it back to the development of empathy. And we initially feel empathy for our carer, for our mum, for our dad, whoever's looking after us. And it's from that empathy that we start developing a sense of care about the broader world and the non-human environment, if you like. So those nature experiences are very important for developing those fundamental cognitive processes out of which we develop a care and a concern for the environment around us. But then later on, when you start approaching adolescence, we know that the brain again develops in a surprising way. We become more concerned with the opinions of our peers. We become there are certain sort of pubertal dips in terms of some cognitive functions. We start worrying about our identity, who we are. And what we see is that some students, if they see the environment as part of their identity, then yes, they become very, very, concerned about the environment, but actually in general there is a pubertal dip in concern about the environment around adolescence. As people become more sensitized to the views of their peers, they become more sort of human-centered, if you like. And that's all quite natural, but what it means is that we need to approach teenagers with different types of strategies that include their peers and their concerns for their peers' opinions, such as debate, discussion, surveys, and those become much more important as tactics, really, in order to foster concern and attitude and positive attitudes about the environment and positive behaviours. So I think I've undertaken a review about this issue for UNESCO, and you can see in that review how you can align different changes in children's development in terms of their psychology and their brain development with their needs and their abilities and potential in terms of education for the environment, sustainability, climate change.
So, remaining in the notions from psychology and neuroscience, how can this notion help us responding better to the challenge posed by climate change?
So one of the things which traditional educational institutions and educators find difficult, I think, is including emotions in their pedagogy. And as educators, we often tend to steer clear of emotions. We can see them as a threat to learning, if anything. In fact, there are these very unscientific models about the brain called triune brain theory, where there's this idea. Oh, you've probably heard it actually of this. Have you ever heard of somebody talking about the reptilian brain, and this idea that we can get hijacked by our reptilian brain and our emotions can just sort of take over? And that sort of is typical of this idea that we've got to keep emotions out of education. They're just a disruptor, essentially. One thing that we know about climate change education for sustainability, is that emotions are really, really important. I mean, in fact, actually, the word emotion comes from the Latin meaning movement, because they're precursors. That's why we have emotions. We have emotions because they cause us to do certain things. They're motivators. And so if we are really serious about providing education for empowering children to undertake new initiatives and to think about things in a new way, we have to be serious about fostering their emotions and encouraging them to feel concern for their environment. And concern, sounds like a bit like a negative emotion. And so suddenly you get this nervousness of like, oh, well, we don't really want to worry the children. And indeed, it is complex, this, because when does fostering concern become fostering eco-anxiety? What is the positive role of negative emotions in the classroom? And I think a lot of people just like to sort of a lot of teachers like to stay clear of them, really. We worry about children's mental health and well-being. So I think what the science does is provide an authority to be able to think more critically about this, and in a more balanced way, and in a way which is more contributing actually to children's well-being and their education in a thoughtful, measured way, so that we have a better sense of when concern becomes eco-anxiety. When does fostering hope, which is the other side of it, when does that start leading to just inaction? I mean, we want to foster hope, but we also want children to feel concerned. So we have to have this sort of balance. And I think it's around emotions that the authority of science can be really helpful in dissipating some of these myths and encouraging educators to move towards a more emotionally intelligent approach to teaching in the classroom. And actually, and I'll say that it's not the intelligence of teachers in any respect that I'm criticizing here. It's actually the sensitivity and nervousness of our cultural institutions, and the fact that I'm hoping that teachers will feel more confident and feel supported by the science to be able to tackle some of these
Why
emotions.
does this matter beyond the classroom?
So many of the processes, first of all, involved with educating children are also involved with educating adults. And in fact, a lot of the research that I've mentioned and I draw upon it is with adults. But we are also in a stage where we need to be educating ourselves. I mean, I'm educating myself every day about the environment, trying to understand more about it. I think we all are in different ways, whether we're conscious of that or not.
On a positive note, hopefully, within the discourse of climate change, do you also see space for hope, resilience, new opportunities in how we face this crisis?
I've recently been working with industry, looking at the looking at the uptake of low carbon energy. And at the moment, our country in the UK is lagging somewhat behind the rest of Europe in terms of installing heat pumps. And partly, this could be due to old housing stock, but it's also due to the learning journey, if you like, that customers need to undertake in order to reach a point where they feel confident and trusting enough, not just in the companies, but also in themselves, to be able to commit to what is quite a sizable investment in a new approach to quite a personal thing, because I think our heating and how we heat our homes is quite personal. So not just teachers, but also businesses in the energy sector need to be starting to think about the sorts of concepts that I've already mentioned when they start communicating about their products, and thinking about the learning journey of the customer, which is also an emotional journey, because a lot of it does boil down to trust, for example, and developing these empowering positive relationships with customers. So there's definitely a crossover here between how we're coming to understand the psychological and neural processes of teaching children about climate change, and also the need to be able to educate ourselves as adults about all the changes that need to be taking place in our lives in order for us to address this very serious existential issue of what's happening to our environment.
Thank you, Paul, for this fascinating dialogue on how neuroscience can contribute to empowering children and teachers about climate change. If you want to continue the conversation, leave a comment below. And do not forget to share, like, and subscribe. See you in the next episode.